Hello, fellow artists. I'm Nicole Chichak. I'm a full-time freelance illustrator, and today I want to talk to you about how to edit your artwork to create high-quality prints. This is something I'm doing every day because I'm running an online print shop called On Lane Avenue. Today in this video, I'm going to show you how to go from this, which is an original gouache painting I created of a pickle jar, to this, which is a high-quality giclée print that I would sell in my shop. As you can tell, there's really not a big difference between the two. They look very similar, which is what we're going for. To follow along with this tutorial, you'll just need Photoshop, which all artists really need Photoshop because it's impossible to edit your work without it, but that's really the only program you need from Adobe Creative Suite. The second thing is a computer. I prefer a desktop, but a laptop will work just fine as well. And the last thing you'll need is a scanner. Any old scanner will do as long as it scans in at 600 DPI or higher. I just use this scanner on my HP LaserJet and it works great. Before I get into the editing process, there's a few things you can do to set yourself up for success. The first is to paint on bright white paper. You can print your prints on ivory paper, but really for the original artwork, you want to use bright white paper. The second thing is to beware of messy mediums, because if you have a lot of dust, specks, pencil shavings on your paper, it's going to make it harder to edit. I love the look of raw pencil, but I avoid using it in most cases because of this reason. The next thing is that you want to try and get things right the first time. The last thing you want to do is be making crazy changes in post. While you can do this, it's a great way to make yourself hate the editing process. So try to be as neat as you can when you're creating your original artwork. Next is clean your scanner. I use Windex wipes to clean my scanner after every couple uses because I don't know how it happens, but my scanner is always dirty and it will wreak havoc on your art files. And the last is to make sure your paper lays flat when you scan it. If it doesn't lay flat and it's wavy, you're going to have blurry artwork, and we don't want that, especially when blowing it up to larger sizes. Okay, now let's get into the editing process. When I'm scanning my artwork in, here's how my screen looks. I'm just scanning in my artwork in color at 600 DPI, and I like to scan in as a TIFF. And obviously I'm using the flatbed function of my scanner and not the document feeder. That would be no good. Okay, so now that I've scanned in my illustration, I'm going to open it in Photoshop, and the first thing I always do is make any areas that are solid white, actually white. So when you scan in an illustration, the background's probably going to be the color of the page, or it's going to be whatever the scanner picked up. So you want to take the paint bucket tool right here, and then you want to play around with your tolerance here. So if you have a high contrast illustration on a white background, your tolerance can be higher. But since I have this very light green area on white, I need my tolerance nice and low so that the white doesn't spill into the green. So that's basically what the tolerance does. So I'm going to zoom in here and make sure that this is set to pure white. And then I'm going to just click the background. And then I don't usually mess with small areas of white like this, but any other large areas of white like this label, I'm going to go in here and just fill those in also. Sometimes you really need to zoom in to see what you've missed. And you'll see there's just a slight texture and a grayish tone on some of the areas that I haven't filled in yet. So it doesn't need to be perfect, but I want to make sure that I've gotten almost everything. And then I'm going to fill these areas in too. Oops. I'll just give you an example here of what happens when your tolerance is too high. So say I'm going to put this at 50. See, that's definitely not the effect I wanted. So you have to play around to see what works best for your painting. And Command Z is a great function to know because that'll just undo whatever you just did. Okay, so the next step is to take your paintbrush tool. We want to make sure this is still set to pure white. And you're going to want to go over the background and make sure there's no dust or specks on the page. So that paint bucket tool doesn't get everything, but it will give you a good base point. So there's some red down in the corner here. I usually really zoom in when I'm doing this to make sure that I don't miss anything. You can see it's pretty time consuming to edit artwork, but you want to get it right the first time because you're never going to want to go back and edit something twice, especially once you've exported out all your files and everything. So I usually just put on a podcast or some music, take my time. I've actually come to really enjoy this process over time. Okay, so I'm going to double speed this while I go through. And once I'm done filling those areas in, I usually just take, that's too big, a large brush and just go along the border here because sometimes the scanner can pick up weird things on the border. So you just want to make sure that this is all filled in. And as I'm working, every time I go through one of these steps, I like to duplicate the background layer just to keep track of my changes so I can go back at any time. Okay, so the next step is to use the clone stamp tool, and I'm going to go through and basically just do what I did only on the colored areas. So what the clone stamp tool does, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is it will take a piece of the background. So I'm going to click Alt and select a piece of background. And then, so I grabbed it from here, and then I can fill in any imperfections. So it takes a little bit of getting used to, but basically what I'm going to do is I am going to get rid of any dust or specks or anything that looks off or doesn't belong on my painting. So you don't want to go overboard with this because I do think there's some charm in having a little bit of imperfection on your work, but obviously dust, specks, hairs, any big bubbles, you don't want to see that stuff. So, use your discretion on how much stuff you remove. You can even, do this on the white parts too if you missed anything. Okay, so I'm going to double speed this as well while I work on this, and we'll touch base when I'm done. So the next step I do is I adjust my colors. So a lot of times these, my painted areas will be a little more thin than I wanted. You'll see more of the paper through it. Maybe my reds aren't as bright as I was hoping. So in this stage, I just go through and I adjust everything. So the way I do this is with the color selection tool. So if you go to select, and then color range. And I'm going to select this green, for instance. And you can adjust the fuzziness based on how much of the color you want to pick up. I just try and get only that color and no other color. So I can see right here that mostly just that green is highlighted. So I click OK, and then I'm going to add a layer. And naming is a good idea. So is saving your work, by the way. So I'm going to save my work here. I usually save as a PSD. So I'm going to save it on my desktop as pickle jar. I'll do the size, 8 by 10. And then I'll do the dots per inch. You can obviously use whatever naming convention works for you. Okay. So now I've got that color selected and it puts a swatch right here. So if I just go over it with the paintbrush, I'm going to make it really big on that new layer and just fill all that in. And then Command D is deselect, so I use that command a lot too. So you can see if I zoom in that it kind of filled in those areas. And if I want to change the color of those areas slightly, I can go to this and go to color overlay. And I can play along with all different shades of greens or whatever else I want. And usually I'm not changing the color of something, but every once in a while I will, and I'll use that feature. But for this, usually I just like to go in and fill in the colors, and then I'll put a slight transparency on this. So this will just make it look more whitewashed or less whitewashed. And I usually end up somewhere around 70. And I just think that's a nice, solid texture. And I like how there's not too much of the paper showing through. So I'll go ahead and do that with some of my other colors, like say the blue. Make sure it's only doing the blue. And then I gotta create a new layer for that. I just like to do this to keep track of what things are. And then I'll go over with my paintbrush and fill that in. So you can see that gives it a really nice texture too, and you can play around with the opacity. So I'm going to double speed it as I fill in some of my other colors. Actually, I'll show you one more, like for this one. I usually amp up my reds. So I've selected my reds there. And I like to just make this brighter, especially because the printing method I use picks up really bright colors. And so for that one, I'll just go over it with a brighter shade. And if I want to ever undo that, you just click this, but you can see how I just amped up that color. The last color I usually do is I'll just go over white one more time. And what this will do is it'll fill in the dry brush areas like this and these little specks and just make them pop. So I'll just make sure with the color selection tool that the whites are selected. And I'll just go over that with a true white and make sure your brush is set to true white. Always want to do that. All right, so the final step is I'm going to make sure my canvas size is set to the size of the print I want because it won't scan in perfectly. So I want this to be 8 by 10. And then I might want to kind of resize how it looks on the canvas. So I just copied all my layers and merged them into one to save all the changes I just did. And then I'm just going to center it on here so that it really fills the space nicely. Perfect. Then save it. And then I usually do one more once over to make sure I didn't miss anything, because usually you do. Even when I do a first print run, I really look at what I created because, when it prints, because sometimes you'll notice things that you don't notice in Photoshop. All right, so that about wraps it up. This is what the final result looks like. If you have any questions about my process for creating high quality prints, let me know in the comments below and I'll try and get back to you as soon as I can. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel. For my blog, courses, and more of my art, you can check out my website at NicoleChichak.com. If you want to see what I'm working on right now, you can follow me on Instagram at NicoleChichak. And you can purchase my prints at onlaneav.com or on Etsy by searching On Lane Avenue. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.